Peace, everyone. Welcome to the Baruti Libre Show, and I'm your host, Baruti Libre Kafele. My topic for the Baruti Libre Show today is entitled Booker T. Washington, the most underrated Pan-Africanist and Black nationalist within American history. Now, for those who may not know, Pan-Africanism is in essence the unification of various people of African descent across the world, or the diaspora, and also the obliteration and the eradication of colonialism of people of African descent. And additionally, nationalism, or should I say black nationalism, is the unification of various people of African descent for the purpose of economic empowerment, for the purpose of political development, and also for the purpose of social cohesion. Now, a lot of people see Booker T. Washington as someone that was just a paternalistic figure, accommodationist, and someone that was for the benefit of the best interest of the status quo as it relates to white superiority, or should I say white empowerment within the political spectrum. But in actuality, Booker T. Washington was as much as a person that was for the liberation of black people as the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who was an ideological student of Booker T. Washington, Malcolm X, who was known for black nationalism as well, who was influenced by Elijah Muhammad, and also who was influenced by Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, of course, as aforementioned, was influenced by Booker T. Washington, as people like H. Sylvester Williams, who organized the first Pan-African Conference in 1900, but preliminarily years before then. Also people like Bishop McNeil Turner and the various others. So Booker T. Washington was in essence a Pan-Africanist. For those who may not know, Booker T. Washington is known or credited for being the principal of the Tuskegee Institute. But Booker T. Washington did not found the Tuskegee Institute. Booker T. Washington was recruited to become a principal of the Tuskegee Institute by an African American by the name of Lewis Adams. Now, Lewis Adams was an enslaved African, because this was around the time of the latter part of the 19th century, around the time of the abolition of slavery and also the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So you had Lewis Adams over there in Alabama. Now, what he was doing a favor for a senator by the name of Senator Foster, because Senator Foster wanted to receive a lot of the African-American votes, because around that time, African-Americans were able to vote. This is what W.E.B. Du Bois coined the mystic years of American history as it relates to African-Americans or freedmen, around the time of 1865 all the way to 1877, which he coined within the book Black Reconstruction. So you all pick up that book. But going back to the subject matter at hand, he wanted to get Foster wanted to get the African-American vote, so chose Lewis Adams. Lewis Adams spoke with him, and what they did was they came up with an opportunity to create an institute for the purpose of empowering African-Americans, or should I say assimilated African-Americans who were enslaved for the past, should I say, 200 plus years within the continental United States, or should I say within the territory of the United States, if you will. So what happened was Booker T. Washington was recruited to become the principal of the Tuskegee Institute, and the Tuskegee Institute was an industrial, vocational, and technical training institution for the purpose of empowering African Americans. That was the purpose of the Tuskegee Institute, and this was around the time of 1881, if I'm not mistaken. Now, when Booker T. Washington created this institute, it was not just limited to industrial training. You had the institute in which you had within the curriculum zoology, governance, the various sciences, whether we talk about chemistry, whether we talk about physical science, linguistics, history, politics, various disciplines. So it was basically a multidisciplinary institution, but the emphasis was mainly on vocational training, creating institutions, building institutions, so that the black man and woman could be the master of their own universe, or the master of their own land, or should I say be self-determined, have self-determination, so that they could be able to name themselves, define for themselves, and do for self, and not rely on the governmental apparatus, or should I say rely on a lot of the wealthy, or should I say the power elite, in order to make things happen. Wondrous work and the meritorious work that Booker T. Washington did with the Tuskegee Institute, it started to get syndicated nationally and internationally, to the point at which you had African nationals coming to this country in order to become students at the Tuskegee Institute, or they went to the Tuskegee Institute to observe so that they could implement their own models. Like, for example, someone from the Gold Coast by the name of Casely Hayford was also a student at the Tuskegee Institute, or visited the Tuskegee Institute. And also someone by the name of Pixley Ka Isaka Seme, who in essence, became one of the founders of the African National Congress. Now, the African National Congress was known for their radical and also their political insurrectionary measures in order to obliterate the apartheid system within South Africa. Now, you have someone named Booker T. Washington, who some people coined the accommodation, has actually influenced one of the most influential movements within African history, or should I say African global political history, the ANC. And also you had people like John Dube, who also implemented his own model from the Tuskegee Institute with his organization by the name of the Institute of Africa at the Orange Natal, if I'm not mistaken. That's the name of the organization. And also you had DDT Jabuvu with his organization by the name of the African Native Farmers Association. So yeah, Booker T. Washington influenced various people, and not to mention his ideological son, who led the largest Pan-African movement globally by the name of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who formed the UNIA, which has over 6 million Africans all over the world. And also, he created a publication within the organization called the Negro World, which is distributed throughout the globe. As a matter of fact, Deuce Muhammad Ali, who was influenced by Booker T. Washington and also who influenced Marcus Garvey while he was in London, as a matter of fact, distributed a lot of the Negro World when he lived over in Nigeria. So we're talking about Booker T. Washington, who should receive more credit than the credit that he gets to this day, as it relates to Pan-African affairs, as it relates to black nationalism, because he was teaching the black man and woman to do for self. He was instrumental as it relates to the protests against a lot of the human rights atrocities that were getting inflicted upon the African people within the Congo, or should I say the Belgian Congo, under King Leopold II. Because a lot of people, we talk about Adolf Hitler for his ignominious and also his repugnant, nefarious, and disgraceful extermination of a lot of the Jewish population around the time of World War II, but we don't focus on King Leopold II, who was responsible for the decimation of 8 to 10 million Africans within the Belgian Congo. So what he did was he organized various protests, let's say Baptist protesters, who went all the way to Washington to protest against these atrocities, and he wrote emphatically about them. You can search them up. It's all public record about a lot of the atrocities that occurred within the Belgian Congo. Additionally, with the influence and the leverage that he was accumulating after 1881, when he became the principal of the Tuskegee Institute, what he also did was become influential among the people within Washington. He was the first African American to actually have a meeting within the White House with Teddy Roosevelt, President Theodore or Teddy Roosevelt, in 1901, if I'm not mistaken. And additionally, he started to build relations with a lot of senators and congressmen, because around the time of 1915, you had the U.S. Immigration Bill, and that bill included the African Exclusionary Measure, in which they tried to exclude Afro-Caribbeans, or should I say continental Africans, from immigrating within the United States in 1915. So what he did was, through his machine of influential people nationally, through people that graduated from Tuskegee or people that were affiliated with the Tuskegee Institute, what he did was organize a whole lot of them so that they could be able to argue, within the House of Congress, or should I say the House of Representatives, against how nefarious this is, and also how this would be detrimental to the best interests of the United States, because this was around the time of the construction of the Panama Canal, and 70% of the people that constructed the Panama Canal, which was in the best interest of the United States, were people of African descent, Afro-Caribbean, 70%. So this was one of the arguments that was disseminated to the people at the House, to the point in which that legislation wasn't enacted, to the point in which, due to Booker T. Washington's protesting, due to Booker T. Washington's agitation, and due to Booker T. Washington's tenacity and influence among people within the public sector within Washington, Afro-Caribbeans could still immigrate to this country, and they were able to immigrate into this country past 1915. So that influenced a whole lot of people. And also, for those who may not know, Afro-Caribbeans have been very influential as it relates to the agitation, the protests, and the various movements, social movements, whether we talk about civil rights or whether we talk about nationalism within this country, a whole lot of them, especially within the northeastern coast. So Booker T. Washington played an influential role with that. That's number one. And also mentioned how he protested against the atrocities which were inflicted upon black people within the Congo Free State, the so-called Free State, because black people were in essence oppressed by one person who owned an entire landmass, King Leopold II. Also, the Togo expedition, because a lot of the German colonialists, they wanted to implement a lot of the Tuskegee forms of production as it relates to cotton production. So what the Germans did was they wanted to implement that program to benefit their economy over there in Togo, and Togo was colonized by the Germans. That became a Western African country, but at that time that was a territory colonized by Germany. So in essence, with the Togo expedition, what he did was mandated that a lot of students from Tuskegee were to go over there so that they could help develop the institutions over there, should help develop farming over there in order to benefit a lot of the Africans within that area, even though it looked like the Germans were benefiting from it, because they were the ones that were extracting a lot of the resources from that area for the purpose of empowering their nation state, if you will, because as you know, that was around the time of Imperial Germany, going into World War I, under Otto von Bismarck and then Wilhelm II and the various others. So you had one of the students by the name of John Robinson, and John Robinson, what he did was he formed his own institute of technical or vocational training over there in Togo. So you had Booker T. Washington, who was involved with the internationalization of the empowerment of black people, or should I say people of African descent. And also, Booker T. Washington was involved with the Liberian crisis, meaning that he was very emphatic, he was very passionate, and he was adamant about the British and the French not colonizing or occupying Liberia, because he wanted Liberia to keep its independence and keep its autonomy. Matter of fact, within the publication, the Liberian Register, Booker T. Washington stated that he is as passionate or arguably more passionate about Liberian affairs, more so than a typical Liberian may be. You all could read this. You all could look this up. You all could study this. This is verifiable, and this is all corroborative. So Booker T. Washington was able to negotiate and facilitate certain things so that Liberia could remain an independent country. And that was through his relations with President Teddy Roosevelt and then eventually President Taft, who became the president after Teddy Roosevelt, and also with various other senators. So he was able to make things happen so that he could have a group of his people within Tuskegee go over to Liberia in order to negotiate on the behalf of the United States government to ensure that the British or the French won't occupy or colonize that region for their own best interests. But as you know, Liberia did, of course, suffer from economic imperialism and possibly still does, with various companies which benefit and capitalize off of the rubber, whether we talk about Firestone or Goodyear, but that's a whole nother discussion. But in essence, this is a succinct video to corroborate or also to basically state that Booker T. Washington is as important as it relates to Pan-African and black affairs as any other freedom fighter. Whether we talk about Malcolm X, whether we talk about Marcus Mosiah Garvey, whether we talk about Edward Wilmot Blyden, whether we talk about Martin Delany or W.E.B. Du Bois. But for those who may not know, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington were actually friends before they were ideological enemies with one another or ideological adversaries with one another. W.E.B. Du Bois, after receiving his doctorate degree from Harvard University, and also as an aside, he was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University, preliminarily studying at Fisk University. He applied for a job at the Tuskegee Institute in order to have his own institute focused on, quote, Negro studies, or should I say Negro history, because around that time, it was rare that people of African descent were calling themselves African Americans, Africans, or blacks. People, for the most part, called themselves Negroes at that time, even though you had a small aggregate of people that called themselves Africans and named institutions like that. Like, for example, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, if you will. But that's another subject matter right there. So the reason why they had their falling out, according to my studies, is because someone by the name of Monroe Trotter co-signed a lot of the Boston riots that were going on. He co-signed the Boston riots. So with co-signing the Boston riots, and W.E.B. Du Bois, in essence, co-signing the Boston riots, and also defended Monroe Trotter. Monroe Trotter was actually an ideological enemy of Booker T. Washington as well, and he was continuous with the slandering of Booker T. Washington. So Booker T. Washington saw that as a betrayal of their friendship with Du Bois co-signing Monroe Trotter, because Monroe Trotter didn't get along with Booker T. Washington. So that led to their fallout, and also with the ideological divergences going on, things just started to change. But in essence, W.E.B. Du Bois was a Pan-Africanist as well. But in essence, W.E.B. Du Bois organized the Pan-African Congresses after the Pan-African Conference of 1900. And those congresses happened in 1919, 1921, 1923, 1927, and also the famous and the most publicized one within history in 1945 in Manchester, UK, in which you had Dr. Kwame Nkrumah in attendance, who eventually became the first Prime Minister of Ghana, who led the decolonization movement, Jomo Kenyatta, who led the decolonization movement of Kenya. You had Pan-Africanist George Padmore there. You had the various Pan-African superheroes at the Pan-African Congress of 1945. So in the meantime, going back to the subject matter of Booker T. Washington, Booker T. Washington is a Pan-Africanist, much so just like the various others that were aforementioned just now. So we need to pay homage to him, and you also could study him by studying people by like Dr. Tyreen Wright, studying people like Dr. Manning Marable, who wrote on Booker T. Washington, and a whole bunch of various other scholars who wrote on Booker T. Washington. So in the meantime, study Booker T. Washington, and most importantly and paramountly, read the book Up From Slavery, his autobiography, so that you can have an understanding of him besides going off of what other people may interpret about Booker T. Washington. So in the meantime, this is my episode of the Baruti Libre Show, and what Booker T. Washington taught me was economic independence, self-reliance, doing for self, and not relying on others to solve the problems that you have the capacity to solve for yourself, ethnically or collectively as a group of people. So may you all have a great day and also study.